Ligayang araw po. Yan, kawawa na naman kayo, ha, magtitiis na naman kayo sa'kin. Tingnan muna natin yung screen natin, ha, mag-screen sharing tayo. Yan, hmm. Anong ating, gustong malaman? I have always known what a good argument is, even before I have achieved college education level o senior high, junior high, pinag-aralan baga yan, ha. Excuse me. 5 nagsabi, yes. 16 nagsabi, some inkling of it, medyo. 17 na. Wala naman nagsabing no, nahiya eh. Filipinos have always known what a good argument is. 16 nagsabi, hindi. Kaya nga bumoto yung 16 na milyon. 7 nagsabi, some inkling of it. Ay pink pink yung 7 kahit paano may alam, yung pink. I know the measure of validity. May alam kahit paano. Pink na naman yung may alam kahit paano, 15. Yung maraming alam, 5. Siguro yung mga ano yan, mga taga-science high school. Ano pa? Words that indicate validity. Factual. Factual, ha. Sige nga. Tingnan natin. Yan ang inyong more or less consensus. Factual. Consensus din more or less, kaya lang mukhang mas kokonti. Logical. Logic. Factual and logical, yan ang ating nakikita 'no, factual, logical. Sige, tingnan natin yan, ha. Okay, review muna tayo, ha, kung saan tayo mga napapunta sa ating kuwentuhan, review. Walang gustong sumali ng live streaming. Nahihiya kayo, 'no, baka magla-live streaming kayo tapos biglang na napasuklay kayo o napangibit o ano, baka makita in public. One of these days may ikukuwento ko sa inyo na nag-live streaming, naging public. Naku, nakakahiya. Ganito, review tayo, ha, review. Yan, ha, pinag-aralan natin, terms. Anong sabi natin? Terms we use. Tama. And what do we use terms for? Terms we use to identify with, to point out with, to refer with. Yan. Ha, maliwanag yan. Where's the light? Where's the light? Yan. Where's your eye? Where's your eye? Where's your ear? Yan, ha. Terms we use to identify with, to point out with, to refer with. And what do we identify? What do we refer to? We identify meanings, or sometimes called ideas, or nowadays we call them concepts. You put together terms, you have sentences, and sentences, we also use them. And as we use them to express our thoughts with. Yan, sabi sa inyo ng teacher nyo sa English, ano. And we use them for our purposes now, better use this expression. We use them to make statements with. Yan. And the resulting items in our minds when we make statements are thoughts. Thoughts or statements or facts. Yan, ha? Now, sabi nga natin, anong sabi natin? Terms have the dimension of meaning. Yan. And sabi rin natin, sentences have the dimension of meaning and truth. Dalawa, no? Yan. And remember, importante sa atin na na matandaan na ito yung gusto nating mangyari, Men can have control over their future. We want control over our future. Yan ang gusto nating mangyari. We want control over our future. Independent of the gods and the deities, dependent on our capacity to reason. Yun yung target natin capacity to reason. At dahil nga dyan, anong sabi natin? Here you go. We deal with language. Bakit? Kasi sabi nga natin, the thoughts that result from our making statements become embedded in our minds. And as they are embedded in our minds, in others, the statements, the facts, embedded in our minds in the form of memory, yan yung linguistic inform. And so, we need to be dealing with linguistic expressions. Ano ang sabi natin? Language is a system of units realizable in some sensory medium, only certain combinations of which have meaning by convention and hence useful for communication, all right? We use. Why? Because these items, these units called terms are realizable in some sensory medium, meaning to say, they are material, physical tools that we use. And precisely, we use terms, we use sentences. And as we use them, for example, the terms in sentences, for example, take the sentence, this table is brown. As we use them, we actually relate them to one another in some matrix of relationships. For example, in this sentence, thanks to this sentence, we are actually somehow relating this item called a table to this item called a color. That's what you do when you get to use such a sentence and therefore make a statement. Thanks to our knowledge of syntax, we are able to form sentences. And as we are able to form sentences, therefore we're able to relate concepts to one another. The result is, for example, you get to have some kind of conceptual framework. So you have terms. You have terms in your mind, and in your mind, these terms are somehow related to one another, thanks to your knowledge of syntax. And as you relate them to one another, you end up with what we today call conceptual frameworks, ergo the expression conceptual frameworks. Now, thanks to your conceptual frameworks, you're able to what? You're able to express some thought, like the thought that today the sun has risen from the east, or the thought that yesterday the sun has risen from the east, or the thought that the day before yesterday the sun has risen from the east. And you have so many of these thoughts embedded in your mind as forms of memory. And as you come across all of these thoughts all together, you get to realize that there is no counter instance among any of them, meaning to say no thought that indicates the sun has not risen from the east. And so you now conclude, thanks to your capacity to reason, that as a rule, whenever the sun rises from the east. And therefore, you're now able to say that tomorrow, if the sun rises, it rises from the east. And that's precisely what you're able to do when you reason. You are able to you are able to you're able to relate your thoughts to one another. You're able to relate your thoughts to one another. That's what you do. And so, here you go. Thanks to your capacity to form expressions like this, in other words, thanks to your capacity to reason, you're able to relate one thought and another 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 thought to one another in some matrix of relationships. And there you go. Given the matrix of relationships, you end up, in other words, with a matrix of principles, a matrix of rules, like the rule whenever the sun rises from the east. Like the rule for all free falling bodies, F equals ma. So, thanks to our capacity to wield language, we are able to establish what we call earlier, we have pointed this out, conceptual framework. And thanks to our conceptual framework, we're able to establish our theoretical framework. Theory meaning to say some rule, some generalization. So not only do we have, as humans, thanks to our capacity to wield language, conceptual frameworks, we also have theoretical frameworks of rules, like this rule here. And as we have pointed out, we are able to relate rules to one another, like the rules of mathematics, or the rules of physics, or the rules of chemistry, or the rules of biology. And notice that the rules of mathematics, we also can relate them to the rules of physics. The rules of physics, we can relate them to the rules of chemistry. The rules of chemistry, we're able to relate them to the rules of biology, and the rules of biology, we're able to relate them to the rules of psychology. Ergo, you can have, in fact, a theoretical framework of all the rules of science, ergo, the system of science. And as we have said earlier, these systems help us to predict. Put together your conceptual framework and your theoretical framework plus your experience embedded in your memory plus your experience embedded in your memory, because you see, you need to benchmark your conceptual framework. You need to benchmark your theoretical framework. And thanks to your benchmarking, now you have an operational working mental model. And that's precisely what we are interested in. How to establish our mental model. A long time ago, we used to call mental models philosophy. Nowadays, we'd rather call them mental models. And thanks to our mental models, we're able to make predictions about our lives. And thanks to our predictions, we're able to have more control over our lives. Therefore, for example, nung panahon ni Jose Rizal, ang life expectancy was only around 40 years old. And actually, 35 to 40 years old. Yun ang average life expectancy ng Pilipinas. Ngayon, ang average life expectancy natin sa Metro Manila, at least 69 na. You know, that's double. Double the life expectancy nung panahon ni Jose Rizal. Indicates we have more control over our lives today. Although we're about to lose it if we vote for stupid people again, over and over again, di bahala kayo sa mundo. Sorry na lang kayo. Tuloy natin. Notice that not only do we put together sentences, we also put together, let me correct myself. Ay naku. Titingnan natin. Replay. Erase. Notice, not only do we put together terms to form sentences, we also put together sentences in what we call paragraphs. Yan. We also put together sentences in what we call paragraphs. So you have here a paragraph. Now, what's a paragraph? It is a collection of sentences. And do you use paragraphs? Yes. We use paragraphs. We use them. What do we use paragraphs for? Pinag-aralan niyo sa English, di ba? English composition. You compose paragraphs. You have your thesis sentence, and then you now have a gamut of all your other sentences emanating from your thesis sentence. So you have a paragraph. Now, what's a paragraph? A paragraph is something that you use, a tool. For example, you use a paragraph to narrate. Dahan-dahan akong pumasok sa kwarto, hinawakan ko yung doorknob, dahan-dahan kong pinilipit, tinulak ko yung pinto, dahan-dahan, humakbang ako pala. O, you narrate. You use a paragraph not only to narrate, you use a paragraph to iterate or enumerate. Maraming dumating doon sa meeting. Dumating si Ando, dumating si Ben, dumating si Charlie, dumating si... You enumerate. You use a paragraph to illustrate or describe. Ang gwapo-gwapo nung opa. Oh my God! And then you say, ang tangos na ilong niya, ang ganda-ganda ng mata niya, blue-eyed, ang kanyang buhok, blonde, matipuno ang katawan, etc. Ang gwapo-gwapo ni opa. So, you describe, you illustrate. But one particular paragraph we're interested in is a tool that's very important for us. Among the different uses of a paragraph, we're interested in the paragraph that we use to persuade with. There's a paragraph that we use to persuade with, and this is so important for us. Hindi ordinaryo. Yung paragraph that we use to persuade with, this is one example. Let me give you another example. Let me persuade you. If 1 plus 1 equals 2, yan, and, mali, sorry ha. 1 plus 1, ay, ano ba naman to? Mali ha. So, 1 plus 1 plus 1 pa uli equals 4. Ay, muli. Plus 1 pa uli equals 4. Yan. So, if 1 plus 1 equals 2 and 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 4, sa makatuwid, yan, sa makatuwid, anong mangyari? Ay di 2 plus 2 is 4. Yan. This is another paragraph. Now, this entire caboodle of sentences is another paragraph. And this is a paragraph that I can use to persuade with. So there are paragraphs that we need so that we can persuade some other individual or a community or persuade ourselves. So there's a particular paragraph that we use in particular to persuade, we call that your argument. Yan. Ang tawag diyan, your argument. Ay, yan. So, we have sentences, we use sentences. Earlier, we have terms, we use terms. But now we have arguments. Another tool in our toolbox, we call the argument. This is one argument. This is another argument. And what do? We use them to persuade. Actually, this is what we are doing. We argue, we use an argument, obviously, to argue with. It's fun. But another way of saying it, we use an argument to reason with. Yan, ano? We use an argument to argue with, we use an argument to reason with. Notice that when you have an argument, there is some kind of movement, ano? Movement from here to here. So, merong movement. Merong isa pang movement from here to here. In this case, ang movement from here to here. Yung movement na yan, ang tawag dyan, inference. There is some kind of inference being made. Yan. And therefore, another way of saying to argue with, to reason with is to infer with. Later on, I will introduce you to rules with which we can infer with, because the way we infer, now those are inferences, they are governed by rules. Much as, for example, our terms are governed by the rules of syntax, our theories, our principles, our rules are governed by rules of inference. And so we call them rules of inference. Pero saka na natin pag-usapan yan, ano? Thanks to our rules of inference, we can end up with a theoretical framework. Thanks to our rules of syntax, we can end up with a conceptual framework. And it is with our conceptual framework, plus our theoretical framework, plus our experience embedded in our memories, that we get to have what we call mental models. And it is with our mental models that we predict the future. Yan. Kung kayo ay board members na isang korporasyon, kagaya ko, board member ako ng isang information communication technology group na binuo ko, mga dati ko estudyante dito sa Piloan na nakagraduate na at nahilig sa logic dahil natuto dito eh. Ako ang chairman ng board namin noon. Small company but competitive. Board member din ako ng isang school founded in 1928, Tayabas Western Academy. Tayabas because Quezon Province used to be called Tayabas. Board member din ako, president ng isang school dito sa Batangas, founded in 1940. When you're a board member of a company, you need to make strategic plans. Plans that involve 5-year, 10-year, 15 years ahead. If you don't do that, you don't survive. And strategic planning involves systems analysis. And systems analysis involves, here you go, mga pinag-uusapan natin. Kaya, ang, Phil 1 ay, uniquely sa diliman pinaglalaban natin, pinagpapatayan natin. Ah, Ayaw natin na mawawala as a requirement of all students graduating from UP Diliman because you need strategic management of your lives, of your community, of your nation. Okay, so kinaklaro natin yung ating mental models. Okay, so remember, ang mga terms, sinusukat natin, terms. We measure them, oo, sige. Halimbawa, how do we measure terms? In terms of our meanings. Yan, meron tayong sukatan, our theories of meaning. Okay, good. Pero remember, sinusukat din natin yung ating, sentences. Paano natin sinusukat yung sentences natin? You remember, meron tayong, pagsukat ng, meaning ng sentence. Remember, a sentence is meaningless if you do not know the truth and falsifying values of the sentence. Tatandaan, Mimsis arborogroves. Ano pa isang sinabi ko? Procrastination brings hemlock. If you do not know when that sentence is true, and you do not know that sentence is false, then that sentence is meaningless. Now, what we want to do now is to identify how we will measure arguments. Because we can measure arguments. And that's precisely what we want to do when we establish the rules of inference. Because the rules of inference are the rules with which we will measure how some arguments are good and some arguments are bad. At the moment, that's what we can say. Terms are either meaningful or not. So, meaning to, ano? Meaning lang ang dimension yan. Sentences, may dimension ng meaning, kagaya nung paliwanag nga natin, ano? Procrastination brings hemlock, at may dimension ng truth because precisely, as we already know, what is true for some will be false for others. Music for some, noise for others. Now, ito yung tanong, ano yung mga dimensions ng arguments? Yan. In the future, I will tell you, this is how we will measure our arguments using rules of inference. Now, paano natin ma-establish yung rules of inference na yan? Ang rules of inference na yan, hindi nyo makikita sa inyong mga genetic inheritance. Yan ay inimbento ng tao. Like yung sapatos ninyo, inimbento natin yan. Itong mga computer systems natin, inimbento natin yan. Notice here that what? Meron tayong relationships, ano? All of this, we relate to one another. Ito naman, nire-relate natin din eh. Ito naman, nire-relate natin din eh, ano? In this case, itong whole kabudol na ito, nire-relate natin dito. And so, when you relate, you end up with some network of relationships. And when you have this network of relationships and connections, you end up with some patterns. Yeah. So, meron kang point, nirelate mo dun sa isang point. O, yung dalawa na yan, nirelate mo dun sa isa pang point. So, and as you now make your connections, ergo your relationships, you end up with some pattern or form. Yan. Yan ang ating tatargetin. Ano ba yung mga patterns or forms na yan, which later on we will establish as rules of inference. Yan ha, dyan ang takbo natin. Now, take the sentence, if 1 kilo of rice costs 1 million pesos, Then 2 kilos of rice cost 2,000,000 pesos. Yan. Now, given this sentence here, I am sure everybody will agree. Everybody agrees. 35 years na ako nagtuturo, laging tinatanong ko. So, hindi ko na kayo tatanungin ngayon. From experience, everybody agrees. Walang counter instance, Ay siguro, dun sa mga troll baka may hindi mag-agree, mga troll ni Bongbong Marcos. But, everybody agrees with this. Okay. Question. Everybody agrees, pero ano nangyari? Pumunta ka sa palengke. So, you go over the marketplace or, talipapa. Magtanong ka, magkano ho ang isang kilo ng bigas? Ako namamalengke sa bahay, sa takot ko na lang sa asawa ko 'pag sinabi, "Ay, punta ka sa palengke, bumili ka ng bigas." "Yes dear, yes honey buns." Ay pagka pumupunta ako sa palengke, anong nakikita ko ay, ang pinakamurang isang kilo ng bigas ay 40 to 50 pesos. Pero merong mahal, yung 70 to 90 pesos. Yung brown rice tsaka red rice mahal. Tanong, meron ba gang, isang kilo ng bigas na sobra sa ₱100? Ay 'pag minsan. Ay meron ba gang isang kilo ng bigas na 1,000,000 pesos? Wala, wala. Pagka presidente na si Bongo, 'yan baka. Ay wala. So, tanong, what is the fact of the matter? The fact of the matter, nobody sells 1 kilo of rice for 1,000,000 pesos. Then why is it that whenever I point this out, everybody agrees? Well, kasi ganito. Notice that in this case, we agree with the form of the sentence. We agree with the form of the sentence. What is the form? It is governed by the rules of arithmetic. Yan. Natatandaan yung rules ng arithmetic. Another, syntax of arithmetic. Ano ang syntax ng arithmetic? Ito, if 1:1 ang ratio, then 2:2 ang ratio. Yan ang rule. Tama? Yan ang rule. So, batay sa rule na ito, we agree. We agree with this sentence. Yan. We agree with this sentence so far as form is concerned. However, so far as content is concerned, hindi tayo papayag. Yan. Natatandaan, meron tayong expression sa Filipino. Ang laman-laman ng sinasabi niya. Nababagbag damdamin ko dun sa guardian. Hindi, gusto ko ano ba mga gusto kong sine, My Mister, yan, Taiwan class, yan. What am I saying? Merong mga expressions na nakakabagbag damdamin kasi ang laman-laman ng sinasabi, naiiyak ka. Laman ng sinasabi. Common expression sa Filipino. Because what we say, what we express, have content. Ano yung content ng sinasabi natin? Are. What's the content? Ito, 1 kilo of rice costs 1,000,000 pesos. 2 kilos of rice costs 2,000,000 pesos. Yung content. Yan. Kasi pwede naman form lang ang pag-usapan, Ano yung form of pag-uusapan? If blank, yun ang nangyari, ano? Then blank. Oh, yan ang form. That's the form. Ngayon, 'pag nilagyan mo ng content, yun na yung sentence mo. Yan, yun na yung sentence mo. So, ano yung content? Yung content, we do not agree with. So, pagdating din we agree with the form, no problem. But what about the content? We don't agree with that. Yan, yan ang gusto nating sabihin. Now, itong paliwanag na ito, ang gusto nating sabihin, bottom line is, linguistic expressions involving sentences have form and content. Yan. Yung linguistic expressions natin, merong on one hand form at merong on one hand content. In the case of our sentence, we agree with the form, but we do not agree with the content. Yan. So, what about arguments? Then that's what we're saying. If you have an argument and you need to measure it, your argument you need to measure in terms of form and also in terms of content. Yan. Now, let me illustrate, ano? Halimbawa, are. Ay, anong are? Hindi are makinig kayo. Yan. Yan. Favorite topic ko ito Bakit? Gusto kong ipaalam na marami akong alam Bakit? Ako insecure dahil lagi akong pinapagalitan ng asawa ko. Yes, dear. Yes, honey bunch. I'm just kidding. Okay. Kabagal naman na rin aking net. Sige, magdasal. Yan, okay na. Sino ito? Yan, kilala niyan, ano? Yan yung nagtitinda ng taho doon sa Palmahol, doon sa steps ng Palmahol. Pagka meron, siyempre kilala niyo yan, ano? Hindi yan yung nagtitinda ng taho, Yan si Albert Einstein. Yan ang nagtitinda nung pansit canton doon sa likod ng Pilar Hall. Albert Einstein. Si Albert Einstein noong 1905, may sinulat na papel tungkol saan? Sa atomic theory. Ang galing. And in the same year, may sinulat pa siya isang papel tungkol saan? Photoelectric effect. Photoelectric effect. At in the same year, puta na, sira ulo may sinulat pa rin na papel, ang topic naman, special theory of relativity. Alien Trish na Special theory of relativity. Ngayon, anong kinalaman niyan sa pag-aaral natin? Wala, gusto ko lang nga ipaalam na ako'y matalino Ganito ang nangyari. Here he is, he's not even a professor, he's just a clerk. And he comes up with a publication, 3 items on the atomic theory, photoelectric effect, and special theory of relativity. Within the year na na-publish niya yung tatlo na yan, he becomes the most famous physicist in all of the world. Within the year. Kasi kumalat bigla ang balita And then within the decade, he becomes the most famous scientist all over the world within the decade. Ang puta na, ang galing ano. And hindi pa natapos ha, talagang ibang klase eh. By the end of the century, at least according to Time magazine, he becomes the most famous and influential individual in the whole world for the century. Ulitin natin. Within the year, he becomes the most famous physicist all over the world. Within the decade, he becomes the most famous scientist all over the world. Within the century, he becomes the most famous and influential individual for the entire century all over the world. Ibang klase, ano. Sandali lang ha. Ako'y nauuhaw eh. Kahirap dumaldal. So, anong kinalaman yan sa pag-aaral natin ng logic and philosophy? Wala nga. Garin eh. Tanong, binigyan ba siya ng Nobel Prize noong 1905? Sagot? Anong sagot? Hindi. Yan. Binigyan ba siya ng Nobel Prize noong 1906? Hindi rin. 1907? Hindi rin. 1908? Hindi rin. 910? Hindi rin. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19? Hindi rin. Wala isipan, ano? Most famous physicist, most famous scientist, hindi binigyan ng Nobel Prize. Ay bakit hindi binigyan ng Nobel Prize? Kasi siya Hudyo. Putay naman Hudyo, mga ulo yan eh. Kaya hindi dapat. I'm just kidding. Ay bakit hindi binigyan na Mr. Mendoza, Mr. Singson, ay bakit hindi binigyan ng Nobel Prize? Kasi yung kanyang argument, yung kanyang isinulat, pagdating dun sa pinaka-importanting sinulat niya. Anong pinaka-importanting sinulat niya? Ito. Special Theory of Relativity. Yung sinulat niya on Special Theory of Relativity ay tagilid. Bakit? Kasi pagdating sa form, walang problema. Mathematically coherent, mathematically elegant, ang ganda-ganda ng argument niya. Pero pagdating sa content, let me write that, content, tagilid. Bakit? Kasi walang experimental proof. There was not a single experimental proof that could support his theory of relativity. Ay papaano ka makakakuha ng proof nung panahon na yon sa theory of relativity? Madali, kumuha ka ng isa, tatlo na galaxy. Yan, lagay mo sa kanang bulsa mo, sabihin mo, yan ang ating normal series. Kumuha ka pa ng isa, dalawa, tatlo, hanggang 10 siguro, na ibang galaxy pa at nang gawin nating experimental series, ay di gay madali. Ay sabi na, puta, paano natin papatunayan yung special theory of relativity na yan? May problema, ano? It was not until dumating si Arthur Eddington. Ang pangalan, Arthur Eddington. Sandali ha. It was not until dumating si Arthur Eddington na nagkaroon ng experimental proof para sa sinasabi ni Albert Einstein. Sino ito? Arthur Eddington. Arthur Eddington. Gantong dating eh. Sabi ni Einstein, if you have a big body of mass like the sun, all the space around it will warp. Ay, hindi ko na i-share. I-share na natin. Dito natin. It was not until dumating si Arthur Eddington na nagkaroon ng experimental proof para dun sa sinasabi ni Albert Einstein. Ganito yan, eh, sabi ni Albert Einstein, if you have a big body of mass like the sun, thanks to the equation E equals mc square, all the space around the sun, will warp. Now, anong epekto? Supposing you have a star somewhere. Say, ano ba, may star dito. And supposing that this is the Earth. Ito yung Earth. Somewhere here. Normally, ang trajectory ng light from a star will be in a straight line. That would be normal. Pero, pagka ang pinag-uusapan ay trajectory ng light ng star na dadaan sa gilid ng sun, magwa-warp yan. And therefore, mag-iiba ang direksyon. Yan. So, madaling patunayan. Kung tama si Einstein, magwa-warp yung space around the sun. Pag nag-warp yung space around the sun, makikita mo may refraction doon sa light ng stars. Now, presuming you know the original position of the star, and then when comes the time nag-intervene ang sun between the Earth and the star, kasi siyempre, naiikot ang Earth around the sun, eh. Merong part ng orbit na Earth na ang star ay nakikita niya without intervention of the sun. Paano nangyayari? Siyempre, di ba, remember, sabihin natin na, nag-o-orbit ang Earth, eh, di ba? Pag nag-o-orbit ang Earth, kunyari lang, ito yung orbit ng Earth. Ano yung orbit ng Earth? Elliptical. Pag nandito ang Earth, diretso lang yung light nung star. Pero pag nandito ang Earth, yung light ay mag-iiba ang takbo. Ang epekto niyan, ay sorry, hindi ko na naman na-share, ulitin natin. Kasi ang Earth ay merong orbit, at kung ang Earth ay nandito, along that orbit, then yung light ng star hindi nagbabago. It's not the same when yung light ng star ay nag-i-intervene yung sun. Ang net effect, yung mga stars doon sa gilid ng sun ay tumatalon in space. Well, apparent. Tumatalon, nawawala doon sa kanilang original position, moving about like Mexican jumping beans. Yan. So, madaling patunayan, may eksperimento. Ano eksperimento? Titigan mong araw at nung ikaw ay mabulag. Ang eksperimento ay siyempre, pumunta ka dun sa place na merong total eclipse. At yun ang ginawa ni Arthur Eddington, pumunta ng South Africa at kinunan ng litrato yung total eclipse ng sun, and then kinumpare yung relative positions ng mga stars, and all the stars around the rim of the sun, they change position. So we have now proof for the special theory of relativity. Actually, ang situation was like this. Ang situation was, pwede naman si Albert Einstein, ay nasan ba yung kay Einstein? Pwede naman si Albert Einstein binigyan ng Nobel Prize for the photoelectric effect. Kaya lang sabi ng commission ng Nobel Prize, if bigyan natin ng Nobel Prize for photoelectric effect at tapos ay palso naman din sa special theory of relativity, which is the most famous of all his theories, mapapahiya ang Nobel Prize Commission. So that sabi nila, at least dapat meron man lang kahit isa lang na patunay na tama si Einstein doon sa special theory of relativity. Ayaw nating mapapatunayang mali, eh. Pag nga may patunay na tama, then we can now give him Nobel Prize for photoelectric effect. And that's what happened in 1919. Noong 1919, nagkaroon na ng patunay doon sa special theory of relativity dahil nga dito kay Arthur Eddington. So, kailan nangyari ito? 1919. And so, 1919, Einstein gets to receive Nobel Prize? Einstein receives Nobel Prize, yan. Ang galing ano, kahit pala Hudyo ka, puwede kang manalo ng Nobel Prize. Yan. Kailan yan? 1919. Problema. Bakit? Mamaya ko ipaliwanag ha, yung problema. Ganito, bakit si Einstein binigyan ng Nobel Prize noong 1919? Kasi 1, tama na ang kanyang argument sa form. Check. And 2, tama na ang kanyang argument sa content. Meron ng experimental proof. So, tama na sa form, tama pa sa content. Yan. Ergo, binigyan siya ng Nobel Prize. Ergo, sinasabi nga natin, meron tayong dimension of form, dimension of content. Yan. Noong 1905, correct in form lang eh. Pero noong 1919, correct na in form, correct pa in content. And so, end product, Nobel Prize. Now, nagkaproblema. Bakit? Binigyan nga ng Nobel Prize eh. O bakit naman may problema nung binigyan ng Nobel Prize? Kasi ito, yan, sino ito? Pangalan niyan si Niels Bohr. Sino si Niels Bohr? Yan naman ang nagtitinda noong, biro lang, magtitinda ng balot doon sa Cruz Naligas. Kabagal naman eh. Hintayin lang natin ha. May tradition sa Nobel Prize na yung nanalo ng the year before sa field, in the case ni Einstein, sa field of physics, siya ang mag-i-introduce dun sa nanalo for the current year. So in the case of Einstein, may isang physicist na in-introduce siya as the winner for 2020 Nobel Prize. Now, yung 2021, ang recipient ng Nobel Prize si Niels Bohr. Yan si Niels Bohr ay magtitinda nga ng balot doon sa Europe. Si Niels Bohr ay ano nga ba yung kanyang nationality? Dutch. Anyway, ganito. Ito si Niels Bohr, nanalo ng Nobel Prize noong 1921. Remember, si Einstein nanalo ng Nobel Prize, hindi pala 1919, 1919, nagkaroon na ng experimental proof. Si Einstein binigyan ng Nobel Prize the following year, 1920. So the following year, 1920, binigyan siya ng Nobel Prize. Okay? Ulitin natin ha. Noong 1919, si Albert Einstein, yung kanyang special theory of relativity, nagkaroon na ng experimental proof. Salamat kay Arthur Eddington. Dahil may experimental proof na at hindi na mapapaya ang commission, binigyan siya ng Nobel Prize noong 1920. 1920, Einstein received the Nobel Prize. 1921, 1921, Niels Bohr receives the Nobel Prize. Ito yung naging gulo. Siyempre, during the ceremonies, ang mangyayari, Einstein would have to introduce Niels Bohr as the new recipient. Yun yung tradition eh. So requested siya na Ito po ang kotse, Mr. Einstein, sunduin mo si Niels Bohr, Mr. Einstein, dadalhin natin doon sa auditorium kung saan may seremonyas, and then you will introduce him as the new winner. Disaster, bakit? Kasi ito si Albert Einstein hindi naniniwala sa quantum physics. Ito si Niels Bohr was given a prize for quantum physics. Maraming dahilan in terms of arguments ni Einstein, pero bottom line is sinasabi ni Einstein yung quantum physics katarantaduhan yan. Kasi sa quantum physics sinasabi na a particle can be here and in another place at the same time. Hindi, kamot ng ulo. Meeting ko, sa quantum physics, a particle can be here and in another place at the same time. Sabi ni Einstein, putang na katarantaduhan yan. That's a misuse of mathematics. Sabi niya, mathematics is never intended to propagate such stupidity. Cut the story short, sabi ni Albert Einstein, huwag niyong bibigyan ng Nobel Prize yung putay ng yan, ha? Kalokohan yan, gago yan. Nanalo. Tapos siya pa mag-i-introduce. Naku, naloko na. Nag-away yung dalawa. Nag-away. Nung nag-away yung dalawa, never silang nag-reconcile until Albert Einstein died. They never reconciled. And even today, merong mga defenders ni Einstein at defenders ni Niels Bohr, hindi sila nagre-reconcile. Tanong, paano nangyari ang dalawang matalino? Geniuses. Hindi magkasundo. You have the same form, mathematics, ang pinag-uusapan. You have the same experimental results, but mathematically may proof. Merong experimental results. In fact, dahil doon sa experimental results, we can now, noong 1970, ang isang microchip, ganito kalaki, sinlaki ng thumbnail, microchip. Yung equivalent ng sinlaki ng thumbnail noong 1971, ngayon kasya na sa 5 nanometers. Alam niyo yung nanometer? Napakaliit nun, maliit pa sa maliit ng maliit. 5 nanometers, kasya na yung sinlaki ng thumb nyo na space. Bakit? Kasi sinusunod natin yung experimental results na sinasabi ni magmula pa nung panahon ni Niels Bohr. But even then, bago namatay si Albert Einstein in the 1950s, for decades on, he never accepted yung sinasabi ni Niels Bohr. May kulang. Correct in form yung sinabi ni Niels Bohr. May experimental proof, may content. And yet, Albert Einstein did not accept. Bakit? Kasi yung po tayo ng si Albert Einstein, Hudyo nga mga Hudyo, gago. I'm just kidding Ganito. Turns out, when you have an argument, marami palang dimensions yung interest na yan When you have an argument, like so, you can measure it in terms of form, we already know that. You can measure it in terms of content, you already know that. And you can measure it in terms of something else. Ang tanong, ano yung something else? Yan. Now, take a look at this. Yan I will draw something. And then tell me what this reminds you of. Okay? So may drawing ako. What does that figure remind you of? What does that figure remind you of? Yan. Hintayin ko yung mga sagot niyo. Tingnan natin mga sagot niyo sa chat. Aling figure? Are Papakita ko lang yung figure. Yan What does that figure remind you of? Yan. Medyo natakloban pala ano. Ulitin natin. What does this figure remind you of? Alright. Yan. What does that figure remind you of? Okay, tingnan ko nga ang mga sagot ninyo. Ano inyong sagot? Rabbit! Yan. Scissors! Yan. Scissors! Yan. Uy, sabi ni Mr. Golberto, rabbit and duck. Okay. Tingnan ulit natin ha. Ay, pwede nga naman scissors array. Pero mamaya na yung scissors mo ha. Gawin muna natin yung duck. Ay, pwede naman duck or bird if you like. Sabihin natin, it's a bird. Yan o. It's a bird. Yan. Robbie Docky, you're the one, you make me happy, lots of fun. Or pwede nga, sabi ni Mr. Golberto, yan. Pwede nga na yan isang klase ng rabbit or hare. Yan, oh. So, there you go. Ay, doon sa iba, pwede rin yung scissors Pwede nga naman yung scissors. Yan, oh. Scissors. Oh, yan. Anyway, the point is, what are we saying? What is a rabbit for some is a duck for others. Yan. Rabbit for some, duck for others. Yan. Or both rabbit and duck for others. Yan. Paano nagkaganon? Sabi nga natin ano sabi natin natatandaan? Meron tayong mental models, di ba? Ulitin natin. Sabi natin meron tayong mental models. Yan. Yung mental model natin dependent sa ating conceptual framework. If you were born in say the town of Taguig or the town of Pateros, kadaming itik doon at saka yung mga itik doon di yun nga ang pinagkukunan ng balot. Ay the first thing that will probably come to your mind ay di itik, hindi nga dak itik, yan itik. So the term becomes very familiar to you because it's part and parcel of your daily life. Excuse me. Ay kung ikaw ay sa Ohio nakatira, gaya ng tatay ko, ay lagi kang magmumura. Bakit? Ay yung garden mo wala ka nang ginawa kundi ayusin ng ayusin Bakit? Yung putang ng mga rabbit doon at saka mga hare wala nang ginawa kundi i-re-raid yung inyong taniman O ay dahil sa yamot mo doon sa rabbit, ay given your experience, very dominant sa isipan mo yung rabbit. And so, thanks to your conceptual framework, therefore your theoretical framework, therefore your mental model, for some of you, it will appear as a rabbit. But for some of you, it will appear as a duck, or maybe even both. So this now gives you what we call anong tawag natin din context. Balihan, nalito na ako Madami na pala natin napag-usapan, ano? So, the figure, depending on how you take the context can be something that involves some bird, maybe even a pelican. Or the context can be involve some rabbit or hare. And so, depending on how you take the context, in other words, depending on the context of your mental model, yan. Then, there you have it. What is music for some will be noise for others. And turns out, what is music for Niels Bohr is noise for Albert Einstein. Let me repeat. Turns out, what is music for Niels Bohr is noise for Albert Einstein. And there you have it. Bakit? Magkaiba sila ng mental model eh. Nagka-letse-letse na. Ngayon, balik tayo din eh. Ay, nawala na ako. Yan, balik tayo din eh. In other words, kailangan ng argument mo correct in form, correct in content, at correct in context. Yan. Now, notice, when your argument is correct in form only, then your argument is said to be valid. Yan ang description natin, ano? When an argument is correct in form, it's said to be valid. When your argument is correct in form, correct in content, then it is said to be sound. When your argument is said to be sound. Yeah. When your argument is correct in form, correct in content, and correct in context, your argument is actually said to be rational. Yan ang pagkakaiba. When is your argument said to be rational? When it is correct in form, correct in content, and correct in context. Now, notice, ang pinaka-importante na lumalabas ay ano, correctness in form. Because correctness in form is required for soundness, is required for validity, and is required for rationality. There you go. Ay, teka. Naloko na, hindi nyo pala kita yung sinasabi ko. Ano? Tingnan natin. Nakakainis. Tingnan natin ha. So, it turns out that one of the requirements natin ay context. Ulitin natin ha. Turns out, one of the requirements natin ay context. In the case of Albert Einstein, given the context as laid out for him by his mental model, he could never accept what is music for Niels Bohr, and so what is music for Niels Bohr is a noise for him, thanks to the specific context of his laid out by his mental model. Now, when your argument is correct in form, but form only, your argument is said to be valid. However, it is possible that your argument is correct in form and correct in content, and therefore, it is not only valid, it is said to be sound. That's what we mean by sound. However, your argument may be correct in form and correct in context, but it is not acceptable, kagaya nung nangyari sa argument ni Niels Bohr sa mata ni Einstein, then problema. For your argument to be fully acceptable, your argument must be correct in form, must be correct in context, and must be correct in content. Sorry. Ulitin natin. Your argument must be correct in form, it must also be correct in content, and it must also be correct in context. When your argument is correct in all of the three, then your argument is now said to be fully rational. Yan. That's what you mean by rationality. The only time your argument becomes precisely rational is when your argument is correct in form, correct in content, and correct in context, taken in the right context. Yan. Ha? So far, so good. Ang problema, para sa maraming tao, ang sinasabi lang nila, you have a good argument. Eh, good is an expression that is vague and ambiguous. Let me repeat. Good as a description of an argument is vague and ambiguous. Maraming tao, they say the argument is good. Okay? But for our purposes, good can mean valid lang. Or good can mean sound. Or good can mean fully rational. Nakakalito. And so, we need to clarify. Now, ito yung isang paliwanag ko ha, huwag kakalimutan. Ano yung paliwanag ko? Huwag kakalimutan. Maraming nakiki-quote-unquote rational. Bawa, yung mga taga-Ateneo, taga-Lasal. Nakiki-rational, hindi naman naintindihan. Bakit? Eh, unang-una, ganito ang situation. Paano malalaman your argument is correct in form? The answer, mathematics. Pag-aaralan natin ang mathematics involved, and that's how you decide whether your argument is correct in form. Paano malalaman na your argument is correct in content? Madali, you just observe. Observation. Yan. Mahirap ba kang isipin yan? Ngayon, paano malalaman your argument is correct in context? Secret. Una, how do you know correct in form? Mathematics. Ikalawa, how do you know correct in form and correct in content? You need to observe over and above your mathematical analysis. How do you know your argument is fully rational taken in the right context? Minimum, maliwanag dapat yung iyong mental model. But mental model, the nature of your mental model is necessary but not sufficient to explain whether you have the right context. Bakit? Kasi context is recursive. In other words, context can recur. The problem of what is a context, that question is recursive. Bakit? Kasi may context ka. Ano yung context mo? Yung iyong mental model. Pero yung mental model mo, may context. So may context of the context. Ano yun? Mental model ng iyong academic circle. Pero yung mental model ng academic circle mo, may context. Context ng mental model ng iyong university. But yung mental model ng university mo, ayan may context. Context na iyong socio-economic and political culture ng iyong bansa. And then you have context of, walang katapusan. Napakadaming involved. And that's precisely what you mean by strategic analysis. We will go into that later. Pag hindi kayo marunong nitong mga pinag-uusapan natin na ito, mahirap magawa ng strategic plans. Ay pagka hindi nyo kayang gumawa ng strategic plans, di anong ginagawa ng mga Pilipino? Magdadasal na lang. Tama ka, Mr. Benoflor. Ano? Mr. Miranda, hindi mo na ako sinamahan din eh. Mr. Miranda, ano? Tama. Pagka hindi alam kung paano yung strategic plan na gagawin, dahil hindi marunong ng systems analysis, dahil hindi marunong ng mathematical logic, naloko na. Anong gagawin? Doon sa Ateneo at Lasal, magdadasal na lang. Doon sa mga paladasalin, kasi ang pinag-aaralan nila ay Aristotelian logic. Yan, homework yan ha, homework. Yung Aristotelian logic, parang nga doon sa mga madasalin, sa atin, hindi na uso yung Aristotelian logic. Hindi compatible yan with physics and information communication technology. Sa atin sa UP, ay ang pinag-aaralan natin, mathematical logic. And yung buong kalahati ng ating usapan ngayong semester ay tungkol sa mathematical logic. Yan. Kaya yung iba sa inyo, isusumpa ako gawa ng magma-mathematics tayo eh. O yan, sa inyong email ko. pati yung aking cellphone, ibibigay ko sa inyo kung wala pa. But, pagka kayo ay nagkakaproblema dahil tayo magma-mathematics, eh, huwag magpapakamatay ha, bawal magpakamatay. Grade laang yan, huwag niyo masyadong pansinin. Si Albert Einstein, mababa ang mga grades niyan, eh. Pero kita niyo naman ang nangyari, Pagka may problema kayo, ay manood na lang kayo ng K-drama. Tawagan ninyo ako at bibigyan ko kayo ng mga rekomendasyon, ha? But, there you go. Sa atin, mathematics ang ginagamit. Bakit? Kasi when we measure form, we will use mathematics. Ergo, ang pinag-aaralan natin, mathematical logic. Sulat na nga natin. Ano ang pinag-aaralan natin? Mathematical logic. Sulat ko din, ha? For the entire half of the semester, mathematical logic ang pag-aaralan natin. Tingnan niyo, are. Yan, ano? Yan, ano? We have one argument here. Ano yung argument natin? Sabi natin, if 1 plus 1 equals 2, and 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 4, sa makatuwid, hindi sa makaliko, therefore 2 plus 2 is 4. Notice, kamatis, na iba ang argument na ito. Ano yung argument na ito? Kung lahat ng ito ay totoo, at lahat ng ito ay totoo, sa makatuwid, hindi sa makaliko, ito ay totoo rin. Yan. Ngayon, focus your attention here. Sabi natin, we are relating this entire kabudol dito. Now, the relationship is describable as necessary. What is the relationship? Is a matter of necessity. Let me repeat. What is the relationship? Relationship between 1 plus 1 equals 2 and 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 4 on one hand and 2 plus 2 equals 4 on the other hand. The relationship is describable as a matter of necessity. In other words, necessary. It's necessary. The relationship is necessary. Meaning to say, when this is true and this is true, hindi pwedeng maging false ito. Necessarily, in other words, this has to be true. Let me repeat. When this is true and this is true, necessarily, this has to be true. That's what we're saying. It's a matter of necessity, the relationship. In this kind of argument, we call this deduction. In this kind of argument, we call this deduction or deductive reasoning. Yan. Dito, iba ang usapan. Notice, even if it is true, all the days you have seen the sun rise from the east, and it is true that as a rule, whenever the sun rises, it rises from the east, it does not guarantee that tomorrow the sun will rise from the east. Hindi guarantee yan. Bakit? Halimbawa, yung Earth may buwan. Yung buwan, habang tumatagal, lumalayo sa Earth. There will be a future, physics predicts this, there will be a future, yung buwan masyado nang malayo sa Earth. Kakalas na yan. Pag kumalas ang buwan sa Earth, yung Earth magwo-wobble. Pag nag-wobble ng Earth, pag minsan siguro rising from the north or rising from the south, yung araw, mag-iiba. Meron pa. Some 14 billion years later, yung sun magiging white dwarf. Pag minamalas-malas tayo, yung white dwarf magiging black hole. Pag naging black hole yan, anak ng tinapay, wala nang rising of the sun. Bakit? Yung Earth hihigupin ng black hole eh. Magiging spaghetti tayo. Spaghetti all over. Parang yung cursor ninyo, pag mabilis dyan sa computer nyo, parang spaghetti, ano? Ganun ang Earth. Ang Earth ay nandito, tapos hihigupin sobrang bilis dun sa black hole. Nandito na siya, pero nandun na rin siya. Parang ngayon tayong chewing gum or bubble gum or spaghetti. No more rising of the sun. Or kung ang ating galaxy ay, bumunggo sa ibang galaxy, magkakaroon ngayon tayo ng cataclysm, wala ng rising of the sun. So, sa ganitong pagkakataon, yung relationship between all of these thoughts and this thought is only a matter of probability. Yan. Matter of what? Probability. Yung mga arguments na ang relationship ay only a matter of probability, may tawag tayo diyan. Ang tawag natin diyan, induction. Yan. So, 'pag matter of necessity, deduction. 'Pag matter of probability, induction. Yan. Sulat natin dito. Induction. Yan. So, what we will do, we will try to so meron tayong dalawang klase ng argument, ano? Yung dalawang klase natin ng argument, meron tayong tinatawag na deductive argument. Yan. At yung deductive argument, ang relationship between the thoughts ay a matter of necessity. Yung inductive argument, ang relationship involved ay a matter of probability. Probability only. Ngayon, what we will do, we will try to mathematicize deductive arguments. Ergo the expression mathematical logic. We will try to mathematize deductive arguments. Ergo the expression mathematical logic. Your homework is this. Your homework is try to find out the difference between mathematical logic na ating requirement sa UP and Aristotelian logic na requirement sa Ateneo, Lasal, at kung ano pang ibang mga Catholic schools. Yan. Ang mababanggit ko lang sa inyo ay siyempre, yung mathematical logic ay compatible with the age of information communication technology. There you go. Validity, soundness, rationality. Dagdagan natin yung kwentuhan. Siya na lang ha, meron pa akong 2 minutes eh. May nakikihalo na kunyari alam yung rationality, hindi naman alam. So, for our purposes, whenever we express rationality, let's use the expression fully rational or completely rational. Para pag tinanong, bakit completely? Marami bagang components yan. Ay, papaliwanag ninyo. Ay, sige, kasi kayo nga ay mga tanga, hindi nyo alam, papaliwanag ko. Yan, may 3 dimensions. So, fully rational or completely rational? When somebody talks about rationality, sabihin nyo, maraming components ang rationality. Okay. Okay, maligayang araw po. Bawal magkasakit ha. Ingat lagi. Marami pa tayong bubunuin. Sige. Bye-bye.